So without further ado, I think we can get going. And Madeleine, I'll turn to you to kickstart us. Can you share some of the insights in terms of the economic interdependence of nature for biodiversity in the context of Malaysia? And what do we need to look at in terms of nature and biodiversity sustaining industries for sustainable growth?
Thank you. Thank you, Dean. Can you hear me? Because I don't know whether I can hear myself. It's a little bit loud. But anyway, thank you, Dean. And thank you, BCG, for inviting me today. Well, I come from a central bank and with financial regulatory background. So, and our primary focus in the past has always been, looking at economic indicators, looking at GDP, looking at gross value added, and it's a very different way of looking at things. Now, but over the last few years, as we gain better understanding on what climate is about, how it actually impacts our economy, it actually, helped to broaden our perspective. It actually helped to, shape our thinking in terms of, the critical impact and dependencies of industries and economic activities on the natural assets. And I think among the central banking and regulatory community, there is also growing recognition that it is actually an important area. There is actually that connection between the economy, and also nature. So, the reliance, and I should also say that at the NGFS, that's the network on greening the financial system, there is also now greater emphasis on nature. Looking at how central banks and regulatory authorities should actually be looking at this topic. So now, when we look at Malaysia, so how do we see this? When we look at the activities, economic activities, things like timber harvesting, things like agriculture, infrastructure development, fisheries, all these have long been the common causes of biodiversity loss. And also ecosystem degradation. And as an emerging economy, we will continue to grow. And what this means is that there will be that continued pressure and focus on biodiversity. And what that means is that, should there be a breakdown on natural systems, there will be repercussions on the economy, there will be repercussions on the society as well. And just to share with you, there was a report by the World Economic Forum. It's called New Nature Economy. Now, over half of the world GDP, equivalent to roughly about 44 trillion US dollar of economic value generation, is moderately or highly dependent on nature. So I think it's a huge amount, and it's an area that we can no longer not focus on. Let me just pause there.
Super, thanks Madeleine. And Simon, I wonder if I could just turn to you to see if there's anything you'd like to build on what Madeleine just said. I mean, you at the forefront of engaging a variety of financial institutions across the world in this space. Does that resonate with what you're seeing, what you're hearing in some of the boardrooms you're in?
Thanks very much indeed. I'm the guy on the panel that doesn't know anything about Malaysia, so let's keep that in mind. So definitely, if we go back just to 2018, we were firmly rooted in a conservation finance narrative that was entirely about raising public and philanthropic money to invest in nature. I mean, almost. And really, over the period from 2018 to now, the pace at which the nature agenda has entered the conversation about financial markets, central banking, financial supervision, perhaps more than monetary policy, and the whole sort of technical data, metrics, risk, all of that stuff has accelerated. The Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure didn't exist in January 2020 was thought about for 9 months without it existing, and we've just come out with the final disclosure recommendations. So that's an 18-month sprint compared to 5 years for the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. So it's like an accelerated lifestyle in the whole area. And to your point, you know, for example, we're working nature finance with the European Central Bank and the Potsdam Institute on Climate, which is one of sort of the world's sort of modelers, doing the first integrated nature climate scenarios to do financial stability stress tests by central banks. You know, so this agenda has moved quickly, but if I can butt in, you know, we don't get out of bed to measure risk. Certainly the financial community doesn't, last time I checked. Yeah, and so the real question is, what's the bioeconomy? Yeah, what's the thing we're actually investing in, not just the thing that we're trying to avoid doing damage to? Yeah, and I think there's a risk, perhaps more so than the climate and carbon agenda, you know, that the financial community is going, I get it, but I don't really get it at all, because I don't know where my revenue flows are coming from if I have anything to do with nature. So just help me figure that out. And it is true that, you know, if you think of the carbon tech agenda, you know, last year, you know, about $1 trillion of CapEx expenditure on hard tech to deal with climate risk and carbon and renewables. And we're quite rightly asked, what's the equivalent in the nature space? You know, is there a tech revolution? What are the new businesses? What's the game at play? And if you'll allow me just to go kind of a minute further on this, you know, I don't want to make life difficult, but I think we have to know what the objective of finance is, not just how we develop regulations and risk models and so on and so forth. So sort of 2 data points, actually from around COP28. So 3 days ago, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, issued its flagship report entitled Nature as Infrastructure, entirely focused on how large-scale investment in nature to develop enabling economic and social enabling infrastructure, you know, is now a completely legitimate target for both private and public investment. And I think that space, whether it's to avoid coastal erosion or other areas, is going to accelerate very rapidly. So this is not just do no harm investment guidelines, but is really thinking about nature as infrastructure. And then the second example, just to complete the round, the Brazil presidency of the G20 began, what are we on, the 6 days ago. They have launched a new work stream in the G20 called the bioeconomy. So the first time that the bioeconomy has become part of a G20 conversation. Why? Because it's going to become a trade issue, and it's going to become an investment rules issue, and it's going to become a financial regulation issue. And some of those aspects can be dealt with at the national level, but many of them actually are of international importance. So I think, in conclusion, there's an amazing surge of work, many financial innovations that we can come back to, but we should always be connecting it through to the real economy that's going to provide jobs and livelihoods and so on and so forth. Thank you.
And that's a great segue to you, Dato Jeffrey, on the valuing natural capital, right? And so how do businesses evaluate the economic value of biodiversity? I mean, I was at Africa Climate Week where the president of the African Development Bank was saying, well, countries need to think about this as part of GDP, right? But how do they do it?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you so much, Dave. And I take this opportunity to thank the organizer and also the Malaysian Pavilion for inviting Malaysia Forest Fund to participate in this big occasion. And I think I'm a small people inside a big people in front of me. Dave, I'm working with Forestry, Malaysia Forest Fund for a year and a half. For Malaysia Forest Fund, our work is focused on the forest, which are actually important ecological complexes, yeah? And to ensure the biological diversity can be maintained. And we are well aware that if we fail to protect this forest, of course, the impact on the diversity will be very extreme, yeah? Then from the perspective of forestry itself, to make the economic value of the biodiversity clearer for businesses, yeah, we must first understand the value of the businesses, consider the important. So I may suggest that few elements. Firstly, the cost management and the efficiency, the income generation and the diversification of the revenue scheme, and also the innovation. So when we talk about managing the forest, because I'm a forester, I've been working with the forestry department for 30 years, and now I'm pensioned already, and I'm working with this small agency under the Ministry of NREC here. So forests in Malaysia is actually under the control of the state of the government, yeah, and which is also behave like a business entity. So state government also look at the income generation, managing the cost and also the output, and exploring what are the opportunities for the expansion. So from the perspective of forest itself, we can see the growing interest from the private sector to get involved with the conservation in activities. So in this regard, to effectively have the forest, businesses must consider a collaborative approach with state government and align with the aspiration. So therefore, the interest of the state government must be taken into account. So that is my first initial, solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jeffrey. And okay, it seems like we've lost all audio.
Testing.
Hello.
Testing. This one's working now. Okay. Testing.
I'm going to pass it back to you in a second. But I mean, if we could build on that a little bit, Alizan. So it's one thing around what businesses can actually do.
Sure.
It's another thing from a perspective of how do you integrate this into strategy? How do you deal with it with a business with a complex supply chain that is in Malaysia from a multinational? So could you give us some insight on that?
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for... Hello? Yes, thank you for inviting UNDP as part of this panel. I think the answer is with difficulty, hinted by Simon as well. It's quite challenging when you talk about integrating biodiversity into the supply chains and so on. And when you talk about businesses, specifically, often what you look into is both the business impact to biodiversity loss and the business dependency on biodiversity loss. So those are two different things which have different strategies. And let me highlight a few of those challenges first before we get into that. I mean, firstly, it's the challenge of course, assigning monetary values to biodiversity. Now, this is a major challenge. Biodiversity has a lot of intrinsic value. Biodiversity is our life support system. Now, how do you actually value them? And then there are other things in, what's called provisioning services like timber, harvesting, etc. Those are what you can assign values. But there are other services that biodiversity provides, such as recreation, such as even, spiritual reasons. Now, how do you assign that monetary value to these services that biodiversity provides? So that's the first challenge in assigning a monetary value. Secondly is the scale and a bit of a mismatch in scale. So again, when you want to value biodiversity, if we go back into the levels of biodiversity. You have genetic diversity, you have species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. So often when you look at biodiversity's value, you often look into, for example, the landscape level, as Dr. mentioned, forestry level. Now, for many businesses, unless you are a company that completely deforests a whole forestry landscape, your impact across the supply chain will be only a partial part of that forest. So again, it's quite difficult to value what is the monetary value of the impact into a specific component of a broader landscape. And thirdly is also the challenge, especially with financing as well. I think it was mentioned before, is the fungibility of biodiversity. Not all forests have the same biodiversity values. Of course, tropical forests have different values than temperate forests, but even within tropical forests, there are different biodiversity values. So these are some of the challenge, first and foremost, for companies to evaluate biodiversity. But moving forward, I think there is a need to first undertake evaluation at that landscape level, and this is what UNDP has done in the protected areas in Taman Negara, in Belum Forest Park, and also in Rompin, where we did valuation studies across a whole landscape area. And we found that, for example, in Taman Negara, the values come up to 1.7 billion per year. In Belum State Park, it's about 530 million per year, and in Rompin, I think it's about 430 million. So there are big values, but again, I think we'll discuss that a bit more. What does that mean to a specific business? It will, I think this panel can also illuminate us a bit in how that affects a specific business across the supply chain and so on and so forth. So it's quite a challenging endeavor.
And maybe if we can move from the challenge side of it, and this is a two-part question that I'm going to ask Simon, Madalena, and Dr. Jeffrey to kind of add to this one. But Madalena, maybe we start with you, right? With all of the challenges and some of the pivots that we need to make, do businesses need to rethink what success looks like when it comes to integrating biodiversity into their core models? Yeah?
Well, I think before you talk about success, I think the key thing is actually how do we get businesses, to start thinking about biodiversity, and how do they then start to integrate this into, the way they operate, the way they think about their business strategies, the way they breathe. It's basically about internalizing biodiversity and nature into the whole operations. And I think, and this will actually be even more challenging when it comes to small businesses, because they wouldn't have the means, they wouldn't have the resources to be able to do that. But I think what and because of that, I think what needs to happen is really for us to help businesses, and how do they go about thinking about biodiversity? How do they then start incorporating this into their businesses? And I think this is one of the things which they can actually do is, first and foremost, understand how does their operations interact or dependent on ecosystem services. That is actually the first understanding, the first step that needs to happen. And because this will help them to better understand what are the ecosystem services which they are dependent on, and also how their operations are actually affecting ecosystem services. And I would also like to take this opportunity to also then highlight that's the reason why I think it was on the Finance Day at Malaysia Pavilion on the 3rd of December, we announced that we'll be working with the World Bank and also the TNFD to look at how do you then contextualize the LEAP framework, the LEAP. So it's a framework which TNFD has come up with. So how do you then operationalize that at the business level? How do you operationalize that even also at the financial institutions level? So that's something that we are embarking on. And the next one, so once you know, what are the interdependencies, then you need to start looking into or developing the integration plan. So you need to then look at, okay, so how do I then set my KPIs? How do I then, set my goals? And also, therefore, how do I then, make the necessary changes to my processes, to my operations? So I think that needs to happen. And once you have that, the third one is actually about raising awareness. And again, I mentioned earlier that, it is something that you need to internalize, something that you need to embed within your DNA. And having, the plans will then need to be translated into how do you then implement it as well. So how do you then ensure that, you have the plans, you are aware about it, how do you then go to execute it? So I think these are the things that need to happen before you can actually get to the success part.
Simon, do you want to build on that and share from some of your experience and insight?
Yeah, so I'll absolutely build on the comments that you've made with my own stack of 3. Yeah, and then we can compete on stacks, right? So over and above the risk and planning side, we have a new set of financial instruments that are emerging that are nature sensitive, both positively and negatively. So layering and taking experience from the dubious history of voluntary carbon markets to date, we have the beginnings of both practice and the evolution of standards of biodiversity credit markets. Now, with the negative reputation at the moment of carbon markets, there are, I think quite rightly, concerns that we begin to develop a set of biodiversity credit markets on the back of it. But actually, the other way of thinking about it is that we can learn from what hasn't worked properly in carbon markets and start to bake some of those governance issues into the way in which biocredits work. And there's an international process now in play, the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits, involving many actors from around the world, trying to figure what the right set of standards for that would be. Second example on the financial innovation is, for example, Malaysia has declared its intention to issue at a sovereign level some sort of biodiversity sukuk. Yeah, so the default in that since 2011 has been a use of proceeds bond. So we will spend money on X, but actually there's no reward for that in the market, really. We now have 12 years experience of there being effectively no base point differential at all. But we have a new generation of debt instruments emerging that are performance-linked debt instruments rather than use of proceeds. So the biodiversity sukuk could say, these are the outcomes that we are aiming to achieve in issuing this bond. And if we achieve them, there would be a step down in the cost of capital. So in the case of Uruguay, for example, they issued a $2.1 billion sovereign bond, with 4 KPIs, 2 about renewables, 2 about forest cover and carbon, with a 30 basis point step down if they achieved the targets, and a 30 basis point step up if they fail to achieve the target. So, 60 basis points is not to be sniffed at. I'm sure you would, Madam, agree with that. So there's stuff happening in the financial innovation space that I think is useful. And the second part is Malaysia has as I understand it, 900,000 micro and SMEs, of which probably, as I understand it, about 200 to 250,000 are part of global value chains. Yeah, I'm not sure if the numbers are precisely right, so excuse me if I'm out a little bit. Those SMEs that are part of global value chains will find a cascade demand for nature-related data, first and foremost. So that's as TNFD begins to cascade down supply chains. And gradually, it won't be just an information disclosure, but there'll be normative associations as to what those SMEs have to achieve. Now, The truth is that this could impose some significant costs on Malaysian SMEs, and we need to think about how to make that work. But the reality is that that SME community trading in international markets are going to face those challenges going forward. And then third, really back to my bioeconomy story, I think we all probably have a slightly different imagination about what that means. Some of us will think it's nuts and fruit. Some of us will think it includes tree products, forest products. But actually, certainly from the Brazilian point of view, it includes biotechnology, it includes biofuels, it includes a whole lot of new technology areas that are intimately linked to biodiversity and actually will form the basis of a whole new generation of global large markets. So this is not a small-scale game that we're talking about. This is a very large-scale game that we're talking about. And where Malaysia sits in that as a nature-rich economy is going to be a critical issue for its international competitiveness. Thank you.
Super, thanks, Simon. And Dr. Jeffrey, I think it's a nice point to come to you straight after that, because we've heard about a few global examples, but what's happening in Malaysia? Some real success stories that you could highlight that are moving the needle.
Thank you, Dave, for the question. Of course, what I try to say this afternoon is actually Malaysia Forest Fund is an agency under the NREC, and our core focus is to develop and operationalize and implement the finance strategies to help the forest. So currently, MFF is developing two instruments under the RED Plus finance framework, namely the Forest Conservation Certificate, acronym FCC, and the Forest Carbon Offset FCO protocols. So the Forest Conservation Certificate is a non-market instrument developed to provide recognition for the voluntary contribution from companies or donors, as well as proponents that implement sustainable forest initiative. The FCC is meant to provide a long-term financing mechanism for forest projects, as well as to ensure transparency and accountability of projects implemented on the ground. The FCC has been approved by the Ministry of Finance to provide the donor with a tax incentive under the provision 44(11C) of the Income Tax Act. So donors that contribute to this FCC project will enjoy a tax deduction of up to 10% of their aggregated income. Then these funds that are channeled to the FCC project will be held on trust by MFF and distributed to the proponents by phases of agreed milestone. So the FCC process also goes through a monitoring phase and the third-party audit, which is required every year to ensure that the project are implemented and intended benefits are achieved. And MFF, in scheduling a town hall session in this month, on the 14th, to get the further feedback from the stakeholders in our country. So the next one is the forest carbon offset. This is a market focusing on the carbon benefits. The FCO is an instrument that allows the transfer of high quality and verified GHG reduction or removals from forest projects to buyers that are looking to offset their hard to abate the emission. The FCO is essentially a domestic carbon offsetting scheme that is aligned for contemporary requirement of high quality GHG and the carbon mitigation projects, including requirement around first the robust accounting methodologies, and also the baseline additionality, the permanence, the leakage mitigation, the validation, the verification, also the climate, community and biodiversity impact. So this FCO is currently under the development through a feasibility study and the development of our methodology is expected by March first quarter of the 2024. And these are some of the opportunities that company can leverage from MFF in terms of getting involved in this biodiversity conservation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Alizan, I'd like to come to you and probably Madalena to build on the next one. But what are some of the enabling conditions to begin to scale, right? You know, we know nature, biodiversity, we need an element of collective action, right? It's too big for one sector on its own. We have to work across our boundaries. And perhaps, Alizan, start, you know, from that perspective and also some of the policy incentives. What do we need to think about?
Okay, thank you for that question. I think first and foremost, a lot of years we've been highlighting finance as a major gap, and UNDP did a study in terms of biodiversity finance, BioFin, where we found that to achieve the Malaysian biodiversity policy, we had a 1.5 billion annual gap in terms of achieving the objectives of our policy. So often when we think about even scaling, it's really just to first and foremost meet that financing gap, and therefore first and foremost we need the financial instruments. And here I think Simon and Madalena has already highlighted quite a few. Very romantic backdrop. But in that context, I think we cannot run away again from innovative and alternative financing mechanisms. In Malaysia, we have, for example, the ecological fiscal transfers. We are looking into the carbon market as highlighted, but of course we need to crowd in private capital. So in terms of scaling up, this is one area which we really need to find alternative financing mechanisms. And I think, again, Simon has already mentioned, it's different than carbon credits. Again, it's less fungible, it is contextual, and therefore we need to find different ways in terms of measuring them. So first and foremost, I think we need to have a broader and bigger database in terms of biodiversity values. Again, in UNDP, we did it for the 3 protected areas that I mentioned, but I think we need values across most of the biodiversity landscapes within the country, and this can provide the baseline for understanding what the biodiversity values are. Secondly, again, in terms of the financial instruments, Malaysia has also announced alternative financing mechanisms such as the biodiversity sukuk, and we have to find out what are the best mechanisms for Malaysia, whether it's performance linked, whether it's the use of proceeds. It will probably depend on the specific types of biodiversity protection. Again, biodiversity is very complex. Are we talking about conserving a landscape, forestry? Are we talking about a specific species? And one of the early successes is always mentioned is the rhino bond by World Bank. And at UNDP, one of the projects we are working on is to develop a tiger sukuk to address the tiger population. So I think more and more of these alternative financing mechanisms will have to be designed in the context of Malaysia, and this will help scaling up. A final point is going back to what has been mentioned before as well. Ultimately, again, biodiversity by nature is complex. I think there is just a need to value biodiversity. And what I mean by that is in terms of policy, we have to look into things such as water pricing. We have to look into things such as conservation taxes. We have to look into things such as tourism taxes. And again, within the project we did in the economics of environment and biodiversity in Malaysia, there was a willingness for tourists, for locals to pay for this conservation. So I think, again, it's really to raise the value of biodiversity itself. I'll stop there.
Super, thank you. Madalena, is there anything you'd like to add to that? Yeah.
Well, just one point to add, and I think this is where, you know, public and private partnerships will need to come in. You know, there's a lot of talk about blended finance. I need to fight with our next door neighbor. So I think public-private partnership is actually an area that we need to focus on. There's been a lot of talks about it, but I think we need to get on to, you know, action. So what do we mean by public-private partnership? When we talk about blended finance, what kind of structures do you really need So I think that is actually the thing that we need to really get on to. So yes, there's been a lot of intention about biodiversity sukuk, but I think there's more to it. And I think this is where the financial sector will need to come in. And for the financial sector to be able to come in, they need to actually, first and foremost, have a good understanding of, what this, how should they be looking at biodiversity? And, you mentioned about how do you then value it? Because when it comes to bankers, it's, at the end of the day, it's always about dollars and cents. So how do you then translate that, into a language that is, they can understand?
So, Simon, last question, and you're going to have to compete so that we can hear your answer here. But you started this saying you went from Malaysia, so I'm going to use that as a strength for you to take on this last question. It's all well and good what we heard right now, but we know the data suggests we're in a biodiversity crisis. We're running out of time to act. So if there were three things that we need to think about in the Malaysian context, what would that be to make this work now and with speed? Yeah.
I could stand up and sing. Hello. So I guess I would give two, not one, but they're linked, so it's a cheat. So Malaysia is already a bioeconomy. Yeah, Malaysia is already a bioeconomy, but clearly the opportunity and the challenge now is to ensure that as biodiversity becomes a more and more important part of the global economy and value creation, that Malaysia is not stripped back and ends up as a commodity exporter, yeah, with the real value add in the new generation of markets happening elsewhere, in Europe, in China, in the US, and so on. And so really pushing forward on the broader vision of what a bioeconomy is, and ensuring that we don't get stuck with a commodity view, but really a significant economic value added view, integrating technology and biodiversity. Unless one has that target zone, yeah, all this supply side finance stuff is kind of not terribly interesting to be, I run nature finance, but unless you've got that front end, it's not interesting. And Malaysia is incredibly well placed to take a role in the global bioeconomy as it moves forward, number one. And then number two, what kind of financial system is needed to finance that economy? Yeah, what's the role of TNFD? What's the role of central bank and financial supervision? What's the role of financial innovation? How can we ensure that the financial sector is not in some analog pre-bioeconomy era unable to understand the bioeconomy opportunities to come forward? So I think there's a job to do between the public sector and the private sector in shaping that front-end technology-intensive bioeconomy imagination and possibility. And then, frankly, Madam, I think there's a job for the financial regulators, not only on the compliance side, but really in bringing the Malaysian private financial sector to be able to really resource that development.
Great, perfect. Thank you, Simon.
Sorry,
So,
can I just add? Just
go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I do agree with you, because I think for the financial sector, because they are the enabler, because they are at the heart of the economy, and therefore they have a very, very crucial role. So I do see a few financial institutions in this room. So I think it is actually a call to action for you to really do your part.
Great. So I think we will leave it there. I would like to thank all of my panelists and all of you for braving the singing and the shouting. But thank you all. And just really quickly, I mean, 3 key takeaways from this discussion for me, right? I think biodiversity is Malaysia's superpower, and it should be at the forefront of shaping the nature finance journey. I think that was one of the key things that I took away. 2, yes, there are challenges when it comes to nature finance, but there's going to be a wealth of opportunities around nature tech that hasn't emerged yet. So it's something to pay attention to as this evolves. And three, as we embark on this journey, we do need to have some guardrails in place, right? To avoid some of the consequences from our actions. We need to make sure of that. It's a new space. There will be some unintended consequences, but we do need to be cautious. So thank you for attending and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.